All right, so today's lecture is going to be about the design of the tax system. Now, there's a very famous quote from Benjamin Franklin in 1789. When talking about taxes, he said, "There's nothing in life that's certain but death and taxes." Of course, at the time Franklin said that, taxes account for about 5% of the average American's income. Today, taxes can account for up to a third of the average American's income. Now, in this lecture, we have four main goals. Goal number one is to discuss how federal taxes are levied. Goal number two is to discuss how state taxes are levied, and we're going to talk a little bit about spending as well. Goal number three is to identify the goals of policymakers when designing a tax. Goal number four is to identify the three different types of taxes. Now, I'm going to have a lot of different charts on here. All of the charts that I'm using are available from your textbook, and I would encourage you to refer to those to get a little bit more information. And I'm going to move through this fairly quickly, so if you have any questions, you could always send me an email or refer to your textbook to get some more detailed information. Now, if we look at government revenue as a percent of GDP, when we look at both federal and state taxes over the last century, what we notice is at the turn of the last century, taxes accounted for still about 5% of all income. Today, when we factor in both federal and state and local taxes, taxes account for almost 30% of all income. So the rate of taxes has risen dramatically. Now, that's not all that unusual. The more developed a nation becomes generally, the higher the average rate of taxes is. This chart from your textbook kind of demonstrates that. If we look at more developed countries like France, the United Kingdom, and Germany, they're all more in that 30 to 40% tax range. This is just federal taxes. That's why the United States is 19. We have to factor state taxes as well. Less developed countries like India, Mexico, and Indonesia are all in that under 20% tax range. Now, the U.S. federal government, and we're talking just federal taxes right now, collects about 2/3, or about 60% of all taxes in our economy. And the largest source of revenue for the federal government is the individual income tax. The federal government also collects taxes on what's called a payroll tax, which is a social insurance tax. Payroll taxes are collected to fund specific federal government programs. So, for example, Social Security is funded using the payroll tax. Medicare and Medicaid are funded using the payroll tax. There's also a tax on, or an excise tax, which is a tax on the sale of specific goods, gasoline, cigarettes, alcoholic beverages, things of that nature. So if we look at it, about 43% of all taxes are collected from individual income tax, with an additional 40% collected from the social insurance tax. Now, when it comes to federal government spending, the government spends its money on a wide variety of products, services, transfer payments, public goods. The number one area of government spending is still Social Security, followed closely by national defense and income security. The fastest growing area of government spending is government spending on health care, primarily through Medicare and Medicaid, especially as the baby boomers begin to age. Now, when the government spends more money than it actually takes in, that's called a budget deficit. Okay, government spends more than it's taking in. Currently, we are in deficit spending. When the government spends less money than it takes in, that's called a budget surplus. Last time we had a budget surplus was in the late 1990s. This chart breaks down government spending. This is 2004. Currently, Social Security spending has fallen as a percent of government spending, so it's about 21%, and defense has gone up 1% to 21%, so those two are actually about even right now. Now, this is probably the most difficult chart for students to understand. This chart is the federal income tax rate 2004. In 2012, this top tax rate right here, 35%, actually went up to 39%. Okay? Couple of important things to note. Number one, this is on family income. This isn't on individual income. This is on family income. Number two, if you make $30,000, you don't pay 25% of all $30,000. The way this works is it's a progressive tax. Your first $7,150 is taxed at 10%. Between $7,150 and $29,050, you're taxed at 15%. Between $29,050 and $73,50, you're taxed 25%. So on the first $7,150, you'd pay $715 in tax. Then you would pay 15% of the next $22,100. Then you would pay 25% of the next $41,300, and so on and so forth. There's a good explanation of this in your textbook. Now, state and local government collect the remaining 40% of all taxes paid. States collect their taxes in a wider variety than the federal government does. Most states collect the majority of their tax through the state sales tax. Here in Illinois, we actually collect more of our tax through the individual income tax than the state sales tax. Local governments, school districts, fire districts, libraries, really do rely on the property tax more than anything else. Now, local governments spend their money on a narrower amount of things. So the number one area for state and local government spending is and has been for some time education. The number two area for state and local government spending is public welfare. Now, this isn't welfare in the sense that you think of it. This is welfare in terms of fire protection, police protection, courts, and prisons. And the number three area of spending is roads. Now, when policymakers design a tax, they have two primary goals: efficiency and equity. Efficiency is the idea that the tax can raise a large amount of revenue at a low cost. Okay? So it can raise a lot of revenue at a low cost. So one of the ways that tax systems can be efficient is if they try to minimize dead weight loss. We learned about dead weight loss some time ago. That's the decline in surplus that happens as a result of a tax. So when a tax tries to be efficient, you try to keep the dead weight loss to a minimum. Another way that you could make a tax more efficient is to create a low administrative burden. Administrative burden is just the time, hassle, effort, and energy that goes into paying your tax. Taxes and efficiency. There really are a couple of different ways to think about efficiency. The real cost of a tax isn't just the tax payment itself. It's the tax payment, the dead weight loss, and the administrative burden. When it comes to taxes and equity, what we're really talking about is how fairly or how evenly the tax is divided throughout society. And there are a couple of different ways to think about this. There's the benefits principle and the ability to pay principle. And when it comes to equity, we look at two different factors, two different ways of measuring equity. The average tax rate, which is total tax divided by income. So average tax rate, if I had $100,000 and I paid $20,000 in taxes, my average tax rate would be $20,000. And then the marginal tax rate, which is how much tax you're going to pay on your next dollar of income. Marginal tax rate really is measuring how much the tax is going to distort the incentive. So if I have a really high marginal tax rate on income, for example, I might choose to cut back on the amount I work. Average tax rate is really measuring how much sacrifice an individual taxpayer is making. Now, the benefits principle is the idea that people should pay taxes based on the benefit they receive from government service. Probably the classic example is the tax on gasoline. People who drive purchase gasoline. People who purchase gasoline pay the tax on gasoline. That tax is then used to build roads, and the roads are driven on by the people who are buying the gasoline. The ability to pay principal, is the idea that taxes should be levied according to how well that person could shoulder the burden. And there are two kind of corollaries that go along with this: the notion of vertical equity and the notion of horizontal equity. Vertical equity is the idea that taxes should fall more heavily on people who can afford to pay them. So, for example, a progressive tax where you have a really high income has a really high income tax rate, has the notion of vertical equity. A lump sum tax is a tax that's the same for everyone regardless of how much they pay. So, for example, if everyone in society collects exactly $6,000 in government services, everyone would be taxed exactly $6,000. The issue with a lump sum tax, while it would be highly efficient, it would cause very little dead weight loss because the marginal tax rate would be zero. Once you've paid your $6,000, you don't have to pay any more. Very, very efficient type of tax. The primary issue with it is it's incredibly regressive. Falls much, much more heavily on poor people than on wealthy people. So, for example, if you made $10,000, you would pay a 60% tax on a $6,000 tax. If you made $100,000, you would pay 6%. If you made $1 million, you would pay 0.6%, so on and so forth. So when we look at the ability to pay principal, there's really three different types of taxes that we want to look at. There's a proportional tax, a regressive tax, and a progressive tax. A proportional tax, the percent is the same for everyone. This is also called a flat tax. So if it's 15%, everyone pays exactly 15% of their income. If you make $100,000, you pay $15,000. If you make $10,000, you pay $1,500. If you make $100, you pay $15,000. A regressive tax is a tax that falls more heavily on low income payers. So it's a tax that falls more heavily on the poor. And a progressive tax is a tax that falls more heavily on the wealthy. So here are kind of three different tax systems we can look at. A proportional tax, on $50,000, the government collects 25%. That'd be $120 or $12,500. On $100,000, the government would collect $25,000, and on $200,000, the government would collect $50,000. A regressive tax on an income of $50,000, the government collects $15,000. That'd be 30%. On an income of $100,000, the government collects $25,000. That'd be 25%. And as you can see, as your income rises, the percent paid actually falls. And then a progressive tax, as income rises, the percent paid rises. The second corollary that we want to look at in terms of the ability to pay principal is the notion of horizontal equity. That's the idea that taxpayers with a similar ability to shoulder a tax, so taxpayers with similar incomes, would actually pay the same amount in taxes. The American tax system does not really push the notion of horizontal equity very strongly. We allow many different deductions and write-offs and credits, which actually reduce taxpayers' overall tax burden. So, for example, a married couple earning $50,000 a year would pay an average of about 25% per year. The same married couple with a child would have a $3,000 less per year overall tax burden, because